Betrayed by everyone, AK-9 German Shepherds sat frozen in the storm, losing the will to survive. Betrayed, abandoned, and left to die, the storm raged mercilessly, icy winds cutting through the darkness. In the middle of it sat Shadow, a K-9 German Shepherd who had once been a hero, but now was nothing. His handler, his team, they had all turned their backs on him. Frozen and exhausted, he no longer wanted to survive, but fate wasn't done with him yet. What happened next would change everything forever. Before we begin, subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications to support more incredible stories like this one. The wind howled to a frozen landscape, slicing through the night like a blade. Snow piled high against the twisted remains of an old wooden fence, and in the middle of it all, a lone figure sat motionless. Shadow, a once proud K-9 German Shepherd, barely lifting his head against the storm. His thick coat was matted with ice, his paws numb from the cold pressing into his body. His breath came in slow, ragged puffs, barely visible against the darkness. Everything he had ever known was gone. The pain of betrayal hurt worse than the wind. Shadow had once belonged to a handler who had sworn loyalty to him, a man who had promised to protect him the same way he had protected their team. They had faced danger together, chased criminals through alleyways, searched for missing children, and stood side by side in moments of life and death. Shadow had given everything to the job, to his handler, to the team, and in the end, they had abandoned him. It had happened so fast. A mission gone wrong, a suspect with a weapon, a moment of hesitation. Shadow had lunged, trying to do what he'd been trained for, but the handler had held back, calling him off. The hesitation cost him the operation. The suspect escaped. The blame fell on Shadow. The accusations had been quiet at first. He's getting old. He's too aggressive. He can't be trusted anymore. And then, one day, the kennel door never opened. His handler never returned. The officers who passed by barely glanced at him. He was no longer useful, so they let him go. They didn't even have the decency to find him a home. They simply released him into the wild like he was nothing. No goodbyes, no second chances, just a truck door opening, a push, and then the roar of the engine as they left him behind. That had been days ago, maybe longer. He had stopped keeping track. At first, he had tried to follow their scent, tracking the familiar oil and leather smell of his handler's uniform. But the trails led nowhere, fading beneath the thick layers of snow that buried the world around him. Hunger clawed at his belly. His body ached. His legs, once powerful, barely held him up. He had fought to survive, but tonight, as the storm raged, he felt something shift inside him. Maybe it was time to stop fighting. His ears flicked slightly at the sound of cracking branches in the distance. His instincts told him to lift his head, to listen, to prepare. But what was the point? He had spent his entire life being alert, being ready, being useful. And for what? To be discarded like trash? His eyes, once sharp and full of purpose, stared blankly ahead, unfocused. His breathing slowed. The cold pressed harder against his body, pulling him deeper into its grip. Then a sound different from the wind, different from the breaking branches. Footsteps, slow, cautious, approaching through the snow. A scent followed, human mixed with a metallic tang of blood, and something else, fear, desperation. Shadow barely turned his head, but through the voice of exhaustion, he saw it. A man stumbling through the snow, clutching his side, blood stained at the front of his jacket, trailing behind him in the white frost. His face was hidden beneath a hood, but his movements were frantic. He looked over his shoulder again and again, as if expecting something or someone to appear from the darkness behind him. Shadow would have once sprung into action, ready to protect, ready to assess the danger. But now, he only watched, too tired to care. The man collapsed near him, breathing hard, his body shaking from cold and exhaustion. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then the man turned his head, his eyes locking onto Shadow's. A flicker of recognition passed between them, not because they knew each other, but because in that moment they were the same, both abandoned, both broken, both left for dead. The storm howled around them, but neither moved. The man clutched his side, trying to push himself up. He staggered toward Shadow, falling to his knees just a foot away. His breath came in ragged gasps, his hands trembling. "Help me," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. Shadow didn't move. He didn't react. He had saved humans before. He had given everything to them, and they had turned their backs on him. So why should he care now? He closed his eyes, the weight of exhaustion pulling him under. The man shivered violently, struggling to stay upright. The scent of blood was stronger now. Whatever had happened to him, he didn't have long. Then, through the woes of exhaustion, something flickered inside Shadow, an instinct, a memory, a purpose buried beneath all the pain. He had been trained to protect. It was in his blood, in his bones. No matter how much the world had failed him, he wasn't sure he could fight against who he truly was. Not yet. With a slow, painful movement, he lifted his head, ears twitching as he listened to the wind. Someone else was out there, and they were coming. The man's breathing was shallow. His body was shaking from cold and blood loss. Shadow watched him through tired, heavy eyes. Every instinct told him to look away, to ignore the human's suffering, the same way humans had ignored his. But something inside him wouldn't let him. The wind howled again, carrying a scent that sent a warning deep into Shadow's bones. They were being hunted. He pushed himself up, his muscles stiff and aching from the cold. The man groaned as he tried to move, his hands slipping against the ice. He was weak, too weak to run, too weak to fight. Shadow could leave him. It wasn't his responsibility anymore. But yet, his body acted before his mind could stop it. With slow, careful steps, Shadow approached the man, sniffing the air around him. The scent of blood was thick, but underneath it was something else. Something familiar. Leather, gunpowder, police gear. Shadow hesitated. This man wasn't just any stranger. He was one of them. A cop. Rage flared inside him, sharp and bitter. Hadn't they done enough? Hadn't they already taken everything from him? Hadn't they already proven they didn't care? His lips curled slightly, the beginnings of a growl forming in his throat. Then the man whispered something. His voice was weak, barely a breath, but Shadow heard it clearly. "Please." A single word. No orders, no commands. Just desperation. The sound of snapping branches cut through the wind. Someone was close. Shadow's ears twitched. He turned his head toward the darkness beyond the trees. His vision blurred from exhaustion, but moments ago, his body frozen in pain suddenly felt alert. His instincts screamed at him. Danger. The man tried to push himself up again, his fingers digging into the snow. "They're coming," he whispered. "They can't find me." Shadow's mind raced. His trust in humans had been shattered, but his training remained. He knew how to track. He knew how to hide. He knew how to survive. He could run. He could leave this man behind. Let fate decide his outcome. But deep inside, he wasn't built to abandon. Shadow lowered his head, pressing his nose against the man's shoulder. He caught a faint scent beneath the blood, a vest, a badge, a man who had once taken an oath. Maybe this one was different. Maybe it didn't matter anymore. The wind shifted, carrying voices. Low, distant, but closing in. Shadow's decision was made. With a deep exhale, he moved closer to the man, nudging him forward. The man groaned, barely able to keep himself upright. Shadow growled softly, a command, not a request. "Move." The man didn't argue. He gritted his teeth and forced himself onto his hands and knees. Shadow pressed against him, using his body as support, guiding him toward the tree line. Every step was slow and painful. The man staggered, his boots dragging through the thick snow. The voices were closer now. Shadow's heartbeat quickened. They wouldn't make it in time. His eyes scanned the terrain. To their right, a small cluster of boulders jutted from the frozen ground. Shelter. It wasn't perfect, but it would buy them time. He growled again, pushing the man toward the rocks. The man followed, gripping Shadow's fur for balance. His body was too weak to run, but he moved, driven by the same instinct keeping Shadow alive. Survive. They reached the boulders just as the first flashlight beams cut through the trees. Shadow pressed himself and the man against the stone, lowering his body into the shadows. Footsteps crunched in the snow. Shadow held his breath. The man did too. The voices were clear now. Are you sure he came this way? Blood trail leads here. He couldn't have gone far. Shadow's ears flipped at the sound of safety being clicked off. A gun. A new scent drifted toward him. Adrenaline, aggression. The unmistakable stench of men who had killed before. They weren't police. They were hunters. The man's grip on Shadow's tightened slightly, his breathing ragged but controlled. He knew it too. Shadow's muscles tensed. He could fight, but he was weak. The man could run, but he wouldn't make it far. They had one chance. Stay hidden. Stay silent. Hope the storm covered their tracks. The footsteps stopped just feet from their hiding spot. One of the men cursed under his breath. Damn storm messing with the tracks. A flashlight beam passed over the rocks, barely missing them. Shadow stayed completely still. His heart pounded, but he didn't move. A pause. Then, let's check further ahead. If he's still bleeding, he won't last long anyway. The footsteps started again, fading into the distance. Shadow didn't relax. He didn't move. He listened, waited, made sure the danger had truly passed. Only when the wind swallowed their voices completely did he release a slow breath. The man shuddered against him. Relief, exhaustion, maybe even gratitude. Shadow didn't care about gratitude. He only cared about one thing now, getting them both out alive. The storm had covered their tracks for now, but Shadow knew it wouldn't last. The men weren't fools. They were hunters, and they had come prepared. Once the wind calmed and the snowfall thinned, they would find the blood trail again. And when they did, they wouldn't hesitate. Shadow turned his head toward the man slumped beside him. His breathing was labored, his face pale beneath the hood of his jacket. The blood loss was getting worse. If they stayed here much longer, the cold would finish what the hunters had started. Shadow growled low in his throat. They had to move. The man stirred at the sound, his eyelids fluttering open. He tried to push himself up, but his arms shook violently, his strength failing him. Shadow pressed his nose against the man's chest, sniffing carefully. His heartbeat was weak, but steady. He could still make it. If he had help, the man exhaled slowly. "You're still here," he murmured, barely above a whisper. His breath came out in white puffs against the freezing air. Shadow didn't react. He wasn't here for him. He was here because instinct told him to survive, and survival meant staying ahead of the danger. The man coughed, then winced as pain shot through his body. His hand moved the wound at his side, fingers trembling. He tried to sit up, but his body refused to cooperate. "Damn it!" he muttered under his breath. Shadow watched him struggle for a moment, then made his decision. He stepped closer, positioning himself beside the man and nudging his shoulder roughly. The man blinked in confusion. Shadow nudged him again, harder this time. "Get up." A flicker of understanding crossed the man's face. He swallowed and followed, gritting his teeth. "You want me to move?" Shadow let out a short, sharp breath. "Yes." The man exhaled, then gave a weak nod. He reached out, hesitating for a brief second before gripping Shadow's thick fur. With a painful groan, he pulled himself upright, leaning heavily against the dog's side. Shadow adjusted his stance, bracing against the man's weight. His muscles burned from the cold, but he ignored the pain. They didn't have time for weakness. The wind howled again, but this time, Shadow heard something else beneath it. Voices. The hunters were circling back. A fresh surge of adrenaline shot through him. He nudged the man forward, forcing him to move. They wouldn't make it far in this condition, but they had to try. Step by step, they pushed forward into the storm. The snow came down hard, stinging Shadow's eyes, but he relied on his instincts. His ears twitched. His nose worked overtime, scanning the air for any sign of safety. The man's breathing was harsh and uneven, but he kept moving, dragging his injured body forward with sheer willpower. Minutes passed, then more. Shadow didn't know how long they walked, only that the voices behind them grew fainter with each agonizing step. Then he smelled it, smoke. Not thick like a wildfire, but thin and controlled, a fire. Shadow's ears perked. Where there was fire, there was shelter. The man must have smelled it too because he whispered, Someone's out here. His voice was hoarse, barely audible over the storm. Shadow didn't stop. He guided the man toward the scent, moving faster now, determined. If they could just reach that fire, they might stand a chance. Through the thick haze of snow, a faint glow appeared in the distance. A cabin. The structure was small, barely visible against a white backdrop, but it was real. Smoke curled from a metal chimney. Flickering light shining through the cracks of a wooden door. Shadow's pulse quickened. They had found safety. The man sagged against him, nearly collapsing in relief. "We made it," he breathed. Shadow didn't celebrate. His instincts remained sharp. They weren't safe yet. Someone was inside, and they had no idea whether that person would be a friend or another enemy. The wooden cabin stood like a lone beacon in the storm, its warm glow barely cutting through the raging blizzard. Shadow's body remained tense, his ears twitching as he listened for movement inside. The scent of smoke and burning would fill his nose, masking whatever or whoever might be waiting inside. The man beside him was barely standing, his weight pressed heavier against Shadow. His legs trembled with exhaustion. His lips were pale, his breath uneven. He wouldn't last much longer out here. Shadow had a choice. Go inside and risk the unknown, or stay out here and let the storm finish them both. A sharp gust of wind bit his fur, making the decision for him. With a low growl, Shadow nudged the man forward. "Move now." The man sucked in a breath, barely able to nod as he dragged himself toward the door. His frozen fingers fumbled against the handle before he finally managed to turn it. The door creaked open, warmth rushing out, meeting the icy air. Shadow stepped inside first. His muscles were stiff, his body sore, but his instincts remained razor-sharp. His eyes scanned the cabin, small, rustic, cluttered. A fire crackled in a stone hearth, sending flickering shadows against the wooden walls. A table with half-eaten food, a rifle leaning against a wall. In the far corner, a man, tall, broad-shouldered, his face hidden beneath a heavy beard. His dark eyes locked onto them with cautious curiosity. He didn't move, didn't reach for the weapon beside him. Yet Shadow stepped in front of the injured man, his body tense, ready. The stranger studied him for a long moment, his gaze flicking from the bleeding man to Shadow, then back again. Then he spoke. "Well, looks like you've had a hell of a night." The stranger didn't move. He remained seated near the fire, his eyes sharp and calculating. Shadow didn't trust him. Not yet. The injured man behind him swayed on his feet, barely holding himself upright. He sucked in a ragged breath, then muttered, "We need help." The stranger exhaled through his nose, leaning forward slightly. His gaze flicked to Shadow, then back to the man. "Help, huh?" His voice was deep, rough, like gravel. "Who's after you?" Shadow's ears twitched. He didn't like the question. The man knew. The injured man hesitated. His knees buckled before he could hit the ground. The stranger moved fast. Shadow snarled, stepping between them, but the man simply caught the injured stranger before he collapsed. "Easy," he muttered. He threw one of the man's arms over his shoulder and half dragged him toward the fire. Shadow didn't relax. He stayed where he was, muscles tight, watching every movement. The stranger settled the injured man onto a pile of blankets near the fire, then slowly reached for a metal pot, pouring hot water into a small bowl. "You're lucky I found you first," he muttered. Shadow's fur bristled. The man turned his gaze to meet Shadow's and held up his hands in mock surrender. "Easy, dog. I ain't the one trying to kill your friend." Shadow didn't move. The stranger smirked slightly. "But they won't stop looking, and if we don't act fast, they'll find you both before sunrise." Shadow remained still, listening, waiting. At last he understood. This wasn't just shelter. This was a battleground, and the real fight hadn't even begun. The fire crackled softly, casting flickering shadows across the cabin walls. Shadow remained where he was, standing between the injured man and the stranger. His muscles were still tense, his paws aching from the cold. His body begged for rest, but he didn't trust this place. Not yet. The stranger moved deliberately, slow enough that Shadow wouldn't see him as a threat. He dipped a rag into the steaming water and turned to the injured man. "Lift your shirt," he ordered. The man hesitated, but his strength was failing him. He groaned. gripping his side as he weakly pulled up his jacket and blood-soaked shirt. Shadow's nose twitched. The wound was bad, deep, jagged, and still bleeding sluggishly. The scent of iron filled the cabin, mixing with the smoke and damp wood. The stranger exhaled sharply. Bullet grazed you. Lucky bastard. Another inch and you'd be dead. The man let out a weak chuckle. Doesn't feel lucky, he whispered. Shadow watched closely as the stranger pressed a hot rag against the wound. The man tensed, his teeth gritted, but he didn't cry out. He was used to pain. The stranger muttered as he worked. You gotta tell me why you've got killers after you. The man swallowed hard, closing his eyes for a moment. I used to be a cop, he finally admitted, but I found something I wasn't supposed to. The stranger raised an eyebrow. Let me guess, corruption? The man gave a small, bitter nod. Deep, higher-ups, dangerous people. I had evidence, real proof, enough to bury them. But before I could go public, someone inside tipped them off. His voice was getting weaker, more distant. They tried to kill me. They almost did. The stranger sighed, shaking his head. And now they're making sure you don't live to talk. The man barely nodded before his head slumped back against the blankets. His breathing was slow but steady. Exhaustion had taken over. Shadow sat beside him, ears perked, still listening for any danger outside. The storm was still raging, but he knew better than to trust it to keep them safe. The men hunting them weren't the kind to give up easily. The stranger stood, wiping his hands on a towel. His gaze flicked toward Shadow. And you? He asked, his voice quieter now. What's your story? Shadow didn't move. The stranger smirked. Didn't think so. He walked over to the corner of the cabin and grabbed something from a wooden chest. Shadow tensed as he approached, but the man only set up a metal dish on the floor. The scent of meat hit Shadow's nose. Figured you'd need this, the stranger muttered. Shadow hesitated. Hunger clawed at his stomach, but instinct told him to stay alert. The man didn't force it, just stepped back and returned to fire. Take your time, he said over his shoulder, but you might want to eat something. Tells me you'll need your strength. Shadow's ears twitched. Then beyond a howling storm, he heard it, distant, faint, but unmistakable. Footsteps. The hunters were back. Shadow's body stiffened. His fur bristled. His hunger vanished in an instant. He turned sharply toward the door, muscles coiling with tension. The stranger noticed. What is it? He asked. Shadow didn't answer. He didn't need to. A second later, the stranger heard it too, the slow crunch of boots in the snow. The man cursed under his breath and grabbed the rifle from the wall, checking the chamber. They must have circled back. Shadow bared his teeth, a deep growl rumbling in his chest. The stranger glanced down at him. Yeah, I don't like it either. The footsteps stopped, silence. Then a loud bang. The sound was splintering. The door shook violently. Shadow lunged forward, barking, his hackles raised. The stranger lifted the rifle, stepping back into the shadows. Looks like your friends don't like waiting, the stranger said. Shadow's growl deepened, his instincts roaring to life. This time, he wasn't running. This time, he was ready to fight. The cabin door rattled again, shaking under the force of another impact. Snow swirled in through cracks, carried by the icy wind. Shadow stood rigid, his teeth bared, muscles coiled like a spring. The stranger beside him kept his grip firm on the rifle, eyes locked on the door. Then silence. Shadow's ears twitched, listening. No footsteps, no voices, just the wind and the slow creak of what's settling under pressure. They're waiting, the stranger muttered under his breath. Shadow didn't move. He knew the game. Predators knew when to strike. They weren't breaking in yet, because they were waiting for the right moment, waiting for their targets to drop their guard. The man on the floor groaned, shifting slightly under the blanket. He was still too weak to fight, too weak to run. That meant only one option remained. Shadow's breathing slowed as he crouched low, creeping toward the door. His paws were silent on the wooden floor. His instinct screamed at him to be ready. Then, a shadow passed by the window. The stranger saw it too. Damn it, he whispered, gripping the rifle tighter. A second later, something slammed against the back of the cabin. Shadow spun, growling. They weren't just coming through the front. They were trying to box him in. The stranger realized, one at the front, one at the back, maybe more. Shadow didn't hesitate. He lunged toward the back door, his paws skidding slightly as he reached the wooden frame. He sniffed once, catching the scent of sweat, metal, and gunpowder. Then movement. The door knob turned. Shadow attacked. He launched himself forward just as the door cracked open, his body slamming into it with full force. The door exploded outward. A startled curse rang out as a man staggered back, caught off guard. Shadow struck like lightning, his teeth finding an arm, sinking into thick fabric. The man gasped, thrashing backward into the snow. A gunshot rang out. The bullet missed, burying itself in the wooden frame. The stranger inside the cabin fired back, his shot cracking through the night. Shadow didn't let go. He held on, twisting his body, pulling the attacker down. The man crashed into the snow, yelling in pain. Another gunshot, this one close, too close. Shadow released just in time, ducking as another attacker fired from the side. The bullet missed him by inches, sending up a spray of ice. The stranger's rifle roared again. One of the men collapsed, a sharp cry torn from his throat. Shadow didn't stop. He turned sharply, eyes locking onto the second man. The attacker hesitated. He had a gun, but Shadow was already moving. The German shepherd leapt, his body cutting through the air. His teeth found a throat, a gurgled scream, a body clattering into the snow. Then silence. The wind howled around them. The snow swirled, but no more shots came. Shadow released, panting, his breath visible in the cold air. His fur was dusted with frost and blood. The stranger stepped forward, his rifle still raised, scanning the trees. Nothing. No more movement. No more threats. Shadow let out a low, cautious growl, his ears twitching. Was it over? The stranger exhaled sharply. "Not bad, dog," he muttered. Shadow didn't look at him. His golden eyes remained locked on the bodies in the snow. He had survived. They had survived. But something inside him whispered this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. The wind howled through the trees, carrying the scent of blood and gunpowder. Shadow stood motionless, his body still tense, his breath steady but sharp. His instincts told him to stay alert. Predators didn't always fall so easily. The stranger lowered his rifle, exhaling slowly. "They'll have more," he muttered. "Men like them don't give up." Shadow's ears flicked. He already knew that. The injured man inside groaned, shifting weakly beneath the blankets. He didn't have time. They didn't have time. The stranger glanced at Shadow. "We need to move." Shadow didn't hesitate. He was ready. The cabin was no longer safe. Shadow knew it. The stranger knew it. The injured man was barely holding on, his breathing shallow. The tracks in the snow wouldn't stay hidden forever. More would come. The stranger tightened his grip on the rifle. "We leave now." Shadow's ears twitched. His body tensed. The night was still dangerous, but standing still meant death. Without another word, they stepped into the storm. They moved fast. The stranger led, keeping his rifle ready. Shadow stayed close, his body low, eyes scanning the darkness. The injured man struggled, leaning heavily on them both. His steps were weak, his strength fading. Shadow could smell the blood. Too much blood. They needed shelter fast. Then, through the snow, a light, a building, a chance, or maybe a trap. The stranger hesitated. Shadow didn't. He stepped forward first, sniffing the air. No fresh tracks. No human scent. Safer now. The stranger pushed the door open. The injured man collapsed inside, too weak to stand. Shadow stayed near the entrance, watching, waiting, because he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. The injured man's breathing was slow, too slow. Shadow lay beside him, his ears twitching at every sound. The stranger was silent, deep in thought. They were alive, but for how long? Then a noise outside, distant, unfamiliar. Shadow stood, hackles rising. Something was coming. A car. Its engine rumbled in the night. tires crunching against the frozen ground. Headlights pierced the darkness. Shadow's body tensed. The stranger grabbed his rifle. "No more running," he said. "Not this time." The car slowed. A door opened. Then a voice, low, calm, deadly. "You've got something that belongs to me." Shadow growled. The real fight had just begun.